Good morning, good afternoon to everybody, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you very much to Quinn, who's kindly agreed to come along to give us this webinar today. And we were just saying before we started the session that this we had intended to run this in Santiago last year and also in Toronto this year, both of which colloquia were cancelled, as you know. So we're really grateful that Quinn could come along and do this webinar. So Quinn was a member of the project board that helped to revise the Cochrane's conflict of interest policy, which many of you know will be released in October. She's an assistant professor at the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Toronto, and she's got a real interest and expertise in non-financial interest, and worked with Lisa Berra, who many of you will know is our Senior Research Integrity Editor in the Editorial Methods Department, and also was a member of the project board that worked on the revised policy. So it's fantastic that Quinn could join us today. So I'll hand over. I won't say very much more. I'll hand over to Quinn to get us going.
Wonderful. So I hope you can all see that. Thank you again, Ruth, for the invitation. As we said, we're a little bit nervous. We hope everyone is safe and well. There were riots in Chile and then a global pandemic, but we've persevered. And I wanted to thank you again for the invitation and a chance to address this topic, which I think there is growing and enduring interest in dealing with the matter of non-financial interests. And I'll be particularly addressing this in the context of systematic reviews, Cochrane reviews, but also I think there are some people from the guidelines world, and I'll try and draw some parallels with that context as well. Before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that the work I'll be drawing from was funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the University of Toronto, and I have no conflicts of interest in relation to this work. As Ruth mentioned, I was on the project board for the policy revision, and I'm also currently co-authoring my very first Cochrane review, and I'll draw from that experience near the end. So in the webinar today, I want to cover a few things, but I also wanted to echo what Dario said, that I welcome your questions. And if they are pressing things that you wanted to get out of this webinar, please raise these, and I'm happy to take it in different directions. But I think the first discussion we need to have is, first of all, to discuss the nature and range of these so-called non-financial interests. I come from a social science background and am predominantly a qualitative researcher. And social scientists have long dealt with what we call non-financial interests in the health research world, but under different names and in different ways. And so I think it's important to pin down what exactly are we talking about. I'll also talk a little bit about the impetus for this policy development. As most of you know, this is the first time that Cochrane has introduced a provision around non-financial conflicts of interest. So why now? Then I think because Cochrane has implemented a conflict of interest policy, the next important thing to do is to really clarify, when does an interest constitute a conflict of interest? What should be a priority for managing editors in implementing this policy? And then I want to conclude with some new ways, perhaps, of thinking about and prioritizing the identification and management of interests more generally, and point to some ongoing work that Lisa and I have underway, and perhaps you'd be willing to share your experiences to inform this ongoing work. So as I said, I think to begin this conversation, we first need to ask, what is a non-financial conflict of interest? And to do this, I'm actually going to ask you, the audience. So I'd ask you to open a browser. This will work on your phone, tablet, computer, and to go to this link at the top of the slide, www.menti.com. You will be prompted to enter this numeric code. And once you do so, there will be a number of boxes where you can enter a response. And I think what will magically appear is a word cloud, so that we can start to think about, what does this actually mean? So as you log in, I invite you to start thinking about and to provide as many concrete examples that you can think of when you hear the term non-financial interest or non-financial conflict of interest, and preferably those that you have direct experience with, either as an author, a reviewer, an editor. And I believe you can answer as many times as you like. If you have, okay, it works, hooray. All right, professional presumptions. So as a typical word cloud, the answers that are entered most often, so the most prevalent answers will be the biggest words. So we're seeing bias, presumptions, assumptions. So these are perhaps synonyms. Personal relationships. We've got professional as something quite dominant. Past experiences. Strong opinions, intellectual. We have, I think, religion, funding for trials, interesting, familiar relationships. So lots of personal connections, friendships, long-standing beliefs, appraisal of your own research. Excellent. Well, this is exciting. I'm seeing actually a lot of very small words, which would indicate that there are a very wide range of things that people have encountered or considered. Religion as being a really big one that comes up. Publication, I am assuming that's past publication, track record, identity politics, furthering one's career. I see that tiny one that says everybody. So this is perhaps something that is commonly experienced. Cultural, advocate, promotion. So if we debrief this a little bit, I think what I'm taking here is that there is a lot of things that are associated with non-financial conflicts of interest. I think we could definitely pull out some thematic categories. But I think what is emerging here is an implementation challenge. So I'm going to return to this slide here. We'll come back to these word clouds. So if you go to the Cochrane policy, I've excerpted a portion of the policy that pertains specifically to non-financial interests. So the policy reads, other non-financial interests may result in a conflict of interest that could influence the development of Cochrane Library content. The types of interests that should be considered and declared include but are not limited to published opinions, work as a health professional or advisor on the topic, any affiliation to an organization that has a relevant declared ideological political opinion. So you can see there's some overlap with the policy and suggested interests that are relevant with what you came up with in this word cloud. But I think it also poses a real challenge for editors, reviewers, even authors. This idea of that giant word cloud needing to be considered and declared with every review is a daunting task. And so I'm hoping in this webinar to discuss aspects of this policy provision and to suggest ways of thinking about interests and conflicts of interest that can really help editors, authors, reviewers to prioritize the integrity of the systematic review and to really deal with these interests constructively. So what I find often with webinars is sometimes when we reach the end and the Q&A, there's a bit of resounding silence. So I invite you to start thinking about what are your most pressing implementation questions, concerns, challenges, particularly related to non-financial interests. And as Dario mentioned, there is a questions panel. Feel free to start posting these and we'll collect them. And even just to document them, if we don't get to them all today, this is something I know Ruth Foxlee and I would be interested in following up. So we'll hopefully have lots of time at the end, but please feel free to start. I think I see a hand. Are there any questions up front here? I'll maybe pause for a second. Feel free to interrupt at any time. Okay, wonderful. So, as we saw with the word cloud, there is a wide range of things that people are encountering that feel like a non-financial interest and perhaps conflict of interest. in our work, we conducted some qualitative research to really identify the nature and range of what people consider to be non-financial interests. What is this term used to label? We found they are vaguely and variably defined, and that there was really little policy consensus regarding what constitutes a non-financial conflict of interest. Consequently, without clear definitions, this phenomenon is little studied, and particularly its impact. So I've provided a PDF handout, which you're welcome to download. And this is a table that's adapted from our published study in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. And we did interviews with thought leaders and leaders in evidence-based healthcare. We looked at the literature to see all the instances of examples that were labeled non-financial interests. We looked at policies and what they included. And so I know this slide is busy, which is why I've provided a handout for you to scroll in and reflect on. The bolded things here are various things that policies do cover. The unbolded are all the other things people are wrestling with. And you can see that non-financial conflict interest, this term is being used to refer to the broadest range of personal beliefs, the death of a pet, professional activities, intellectual commitments, social relationships, and then material interests. And on the very far, I believe it would be to your right, is a column of material interests where either the individual or third party might tangibly gain, but it's unclear whether there was actually money exchange. So there's some gray area here between when something is a financial and non-financial. So a few take-homes from this. I think, first of all, this non-financial financial is perhaps not a very useful descriptor. And there's significant overlap at times between these financial and non-financial kind of gray area interests. I think in the word cloud, somebody put up the term everybody. I think another take home we found from this exercise was that many of these interests are universal in the sense that they're synonymous with experience, whether it's professional or personal. And so it's very difficult to determine when one person's interests is more problematic than another. And then finally, I think widening this definition of interests to all of these categories poses serious implementation challenges and may have other unintended consequences. So I offer you this table, but also a request or a caution. Please do not use this as a taxonomy for non-financial interests. I'm going to show you in this webinar why I think many of these are not conflicts of interest and why we actually need to develop a different set of tools to deal with these. All these things are important, certainly. All of these things are influential, but I do not believe that all of these things require disclosure, and in many cases it would be inappropriate or counterproductive. But I did want to give you a flavor for what is going on around this phenomenon and the types of things that are being debated. So just to give you a little policy context. So as I mentioned, this is the first time that Cochrane has introduced a provision around non-financial interests. So why now? I think there's little consensus over what a non-financial interest or conflict of interest is or what to do about it. But there is policy consensus that these things matter and they are important. The concern around non-financial interest is certainly not new. It has been raised and debated since the very first implementation of conflict of interest disclosure policies, probably in the early 1990s, 1980s at biomedical journals. I think often we see non-financial interests raised as an argument against bringing in stronger policy provisions for financial interests or industry influence. But really, there's been very little work on non-financial interests in their own right and empirically in particular. We've seen a lot of recent policy development, and on this slide are all the journals, guidelines, development organizations, and other scientific committees that have policies that pertain to non-financial interests. I think it looks like quite a diverse group of organizations, but it's really driven by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality in one kind of family of policies, Guidelines International Network in another, and the grade group. So I've kind of grouped them. On the far left in bold are organizations that have probably the most comprehensive disclosure provisions and also take very strong action on non-financial interests. So people will be recused or excluded from the process on the basis of certain high risk non-financial interests. In the middle, so the BMJ, the PLOS, Nature Journals, WHO, have pretty comprehensive disclosure provisions, but are less strict on, say, the recusal. And then on the far right are journals like JAMA, Cochrane, following the ICMJE, that have left a very open provision, but are not restricting any action on the basis of disclosed non-financial interests. Across
Quinn,
these
we've got
yes.
Sorry,
Please.
we do have a couple of we've got a question or two in the question box. I wondered if we wanted to have a look at those now, or can we
Sure.
save those up? So we've got a question from Anna. Sorry.
I'm just scrolling. I think I might save these three for the end.
Okay,
These are
great.
Fantastic implementation questions, and I would like to revisit these for sure. So I'll be sure to leave time.
No problem.
Please continue to flag these.
No worries.
Yes, excellent. Oh, these are great questions. We'll get to them in a moment. So I think across policies, the assumption is, and we conducted a policy analysis, that financial and non-financial interests can be managed in the same way. And these policies generally propose disclosure and then various management strategies that have been applied to financial conflicts of interest. So recusal for a portion of decision-making or exclusion from the process. I'm going to submit that we actually need to approach non-financial interests very deliberately to avoid this scenario. So I put this up as an example of, I think, the status quo for conflict of interest management in biomedical and health research. We are increasingly seeing pages-long disclosures that dump information on consumers with no real sense of, often the relevance is hard to distill from a statement like this. The utility of these disclosures is constantly debated, and in some cases, I think there are harms to disclosure, and no real sense of accountability. We kind of are left with this sense, okay, then what? And of course, this is an extreme example, but I think it's important to keep in mind as we debate what kinds of interests need disclosure. Well, what is the end of the road? What are we trying to achieve by this? And so from an implementation perspective, I'm going to suggest that editors need to do three things when evaluating whether a non-financial or any interest really requires disclosure and then other management. And the first thing, we'll talk about this in a moment, is to explicitly identify the primary interest or obligation in that situation. So for the systematic review team. Second, to ask whether that interest poses a competing obligation that would risk compromising the independent judgment. And then thirdly, determine what action is required to ensure that independence and particularly accountability. So this is how we would approach conflicts of interest. A lot of the things that came up in that word cloud or on this handout, I think are very influential and important, but may not actually be conflicts of interest. And I'll talk about this. And I think we need to develop some alternate strategies to promote research integrity and accountability. And this will require some new tools. So let's just revisit for a second the definition of conflict of interest. Cochrane's policy adopts the IOM definition, which is the set of conditions in which a professional judgment concerning a primary interest tends to be unduly influenced by a secondary interest. So conflicts of interest from this definition have a few defining features. They only apply to those who are making decisions, who are entrusted to make decisions on others' behalf. They are situation dependent, and they pose a risk that an individual's loyalty or independent judgment will be compromised. So we constantly have multiple interests that pull us in multiple directions, but they only pose a conflict when they risk compromising that primary interest. So I think we have really lost sight of this primary interest piece. We have a lot of debate and a lot of policy development on the identification and management of secondary interests. We're really caught up in expanding the list of things that might influence judgment. We're constantly trying to figure out when does an interest need disclosing, when it does not. But we really need to, in order to decide all those things, need to understand what is the primary interest and to whom are we accountable in pursuing that primary interest. So the Cochrane policy, I think, implicitly suggests what that might be. I'm going to actually give an example here from the WHO, who I think has done an exceptional job in very explicitly defining the primary interest. So in WHO guidelines, the primary interest is to serve WHO's member states by producing recommendations that improve the health and well-being of populations globally or in specific areas or countries. So this is a definition that is specific. It's actually measurable. You could empirically assess whether certain conflicts actually posed a threat or a risk to a primary interest here. And it can be used to hold individuals accountable for the interests or relationships and actions that they take. So I'm going to flip us back to Mentimeter. So I'm going to change our slide here. Let's see if I can do that. Okay, so same link, same code. I would love for us to collectively reflect in terms of people who are creating Cochrane library content. So we can think about authors and editors working collectively. What is the primary interest? Or another way of thinking, you know, to whom are we ultimately accountable in pursuing this primary interest? On whose behalf are we making trusted decisions? Okay, evidence. I think, again, you can answer this as many times as you please. Health of the population, public health, safety. Then we've also got accurate information, unbiased information. We've got knowledge. And then we're seeing some people, so patients, consumers, patient health, clinicians. Interesting, I'm not seeing, for example, governments or insurance companies or the medical and pharmaceutical industry, Cochrane Library readers, health decision making. So again, I think we're seeing some themes here, but I'm not sure that we're seeing necessarily consensus. And I think some of this reflects a means to an end. So for example, unbiased evidence, those sorts of things still, we still need to reflect evidence for what? Unbiased evidence in service of whom? And I think sometimes we get stuck at the place of just thinking about being unbiased or being objective. But to me, that's still a step along the way. So if we were actually thinking about synthesizing evidence to promote population health or clinical decision making, I mean, I think when you think about what Cochrane is known for, a lot of reviews concluding this does not work. There is certainly, we talk about like independent judgment. When you think about the Cochrane reviews that really create a splash, it's certainly chafing against some interest and established interests. And so I think we need to spend some more time as a community thinking about what the primary interest truly is. I think I saw a hand. Did anyone want to comment on this?
No, we didn't have any hands raised.
Okay.
No.
All right, no problem. So just as a contrast, I wanted to talk a little bit about Cochrane has really focused on the financial interests. And just as an example, The classic conflict of interest might be serving as a consultant to a pharmaceutical company. We have an actual contractual obligation. Whether or not someone's decision making is actually influenced, so in the psychological sense, it still objectively poses a competing obligation and risks compromising the independence or integrity of the review. And we can see the downstream effects of that is that we have systemic biases, particularly because of kind of the power and scope of this third-party interest, the pharmaceutical industry. They may have financial relationships with multiple authors, and we can see systematic biases in research agenda, study designs, publications, and such. So in contrast, when we think about the problem with non-financial interests, certainly some of them will also pose a competing obligation that puts our primary interest at risk. But when I did a qualitative study, triangulating policy data, published reports, and interviews, I really wanted to understand what were the underlying concerns. So with that handout, with that huge scope of interest, what are people really concerned about? Because clearly these things are important. And what I found were four main themes, but that conflict of interest was the word we had, and it was being used to label this variety of important issues, but it was kind of serving as shorthand in the sense that it didn't well describe what was going on. And what people were really worried about were that people would have strong beliefs that might preclude open-mindedness. Could an individual remain receptive to evidence, perspectives, or positions that contradicted those strong beliefs? People were also worried that someone's personal beliefs might override evidence-led decision-making. So this is where people talk about religious beliefs, political beliefs, personal values, that they have a profound effect on how we think and act. In our study, people also recognize that someone's decisions or judgment inevitably arises from a particular perspective, that how you go about things is a product of your life's experiences, your specialty training, your experience with different patient populations, your own experience with a disease, and that judgment comes from a perspective. And then finally, a lot of the time, people were pointing to non-financial interests as a means to explain why they felt a decision was unfair. So a peer review decision, they would say, well, there was probably non-financial interest there, that person hates me, or something like that. And so these are all clearly problems, particularly when trying to produce an unbiased and objective synthesis of evidence that has implications for people's health decision-making, for reimbursement decisions, for government priorities. But I think ultimately there is a mismatch between these concerns and the policy tools that we have available. So for example, in the case of strong beliefs, if someone is truly dogmatic, it is highly unlikely that anyone would ever disclose this or agree to disclose that they are in fact dogmatic. And it doesn't really solve the problem of them being dogmatic. Similarly, I think we're going to talk about this, that some questions have come up. Recusing experts who have a large track record or a lot of publications or a lot of experience with a topic is problematic in that you need experts for certain things, and begs the question, who is left in the room? I don't think anyone would agree that having a systematic review team of authors who don't know anything about the topic or care about the topic is particularly desirable. And then because we have these tools of disclosure, recusal, some limitations with that, there are unintended consequences and other policy challenges. So I know the NH and MRC, for example, in Australia, privacy legislation would actually preclude disclosure of health conditions, political beliefs, religious beliefs. So there might actually be in conflict with other policies. We have to think, I think, about stigma or inclusion, especially around people living with a health condition, and then representation and diversity of teams. I think sometimes when lived experience is labeled as a conflict of interest, we have issues with whether those people are given, full consideration in terms of participation. So one thing I wanted to revisit, what should editors prioritize? So we have this vast sea of interests. We have a conflict of interest policy. When you're faced with all these different interests, and each author will have multiple interests, what do you really need to focus on? And so I propose we review the principles outlined in Cochrane's policy. So first of all, independence. Cochrane content should be independent, and that means thinking about interests that actually represent a competing obligation or can further the interests of a third party and override that primary interest. We've got freedom from interference. So again, it does not have to be a financial interest that puts this at risk, right? It could be that an individual is a leader of an advocacy organization or a political body that seeks to influence the content of a review. Assurance. So users of the Cochrane library should be assured that content is produced in an independent manner. So I think the question here is, if an interest, if disclosed, would it have the potential to change the way that others evaluate the decisions of the review team? So are there things that are important for readers to know so that they can understand the context of this review? And finally, transparency. So are there interests, if they are not disclosed, could they reasonably undermine the integrity or perceived integrity of the review? So I think a good example here would be relationships or something that fall just outside the threshold. We've seen newspaper headlines where someone had a relationship 4 years ago instead of 3 years ago, and it calls into question the entire review or the study. So I think it's, again, this distinction between financial and non-financial is ultimately not particularly useful. It's whether an interest poses a risk to these principles and the primary interest of this team, which we still have not quite come to consensus on, and that they may require further management. So this could be that the authors are conducting a review of an intervention, but they currently have a $80 million grant under consideration with the Gates Foundation, for example. There's no money yet. It's not a corporate funder, but there's a lot at stake. Is there really assurance? Is there freedom from interference? The author is a leader, as I said, of an advocacy organization, a political organization. Again, no money, but there appears to be the possibility for a third party to have tangible gain. We've got, of course, authors of primary studies or extensive expertise in the field. How do we assure independence when evaluating a body of work that authors have been intimately involved with? Is disclosure the right tool there, or do we need to think about other ways of managing that? Cochrane's policy already has authors recused from screening, extracting data, or assessing risk of bias for their own work. Or an author who lives with the condition affected by the intervention under review. Does that truly threaten transparency or assurance or independence? Or is that a different problem and we need to think about that differently? So I want to suggest that there might be other tools that we need. So the Cochrane policy encourages systematic review teams to think critically about how their perspectives, experiences, and positions have shaped their contribution to the development of the content. So I think this recognizes that while it's essential to systematically examine all these social interests that shape the review, it's not possible to eliminate these. It might be possible to make them visible and open to critical interpretation. It doesn't mean someone can't be objective, or that interests are relative. Instead, there are actual methodologies and methods and tools that emphasize fairness, transparency, but recognition of these interests and how they influence the way that evidence is produced and shared. I would suggest that these are not conflicts of interest and that labeling them under disclosure is inappropriate. And the reason is that they don't pose a competing obligation, that people can pursue their primary interest from whatever perspective or experience they're coming. That experience and perspective are still influential and we have to deal with it. Fortunately, there is a whole field, social science qualitative research, that have developed methods and tools, and this is the focus of our ongoing work, to understand whether these tools might be acceptable and feasible for biomedical or health researchers. So, for example, this baby is navel gazing. Reflexivity is a method, an established method that entails an analysis, an actual analysis. It goes in the methods section of your work. How, why, in what ways research is conducted, and understanding the role of interests and power in the research process. I think there is probably a host of other tools that are applicable. So for example, I think we're seeing that non-financial interests often pose a risk of creating spin in research conclusions, hence my spin cycle. And there are tools to identify and detect spin that might be really useful for editors and reviewers. I think Cochrane reviews could consider in the future perhaps incorporating sections in the review, in the methods, that actually asks review teams to position themselves in relation to the work. Where did the research question come from? What is the expertise they bring? What has been their track record in terms of opinions and expertise? And this, I think, would be much more consistent with the way we've thought about interests and social positions in research integrity, without kind of dumping it all into a disclosure statement. So I'm going to actually give an example from our own work. So I'm part of an author team led by Barbara Mincies at the University of Sydney. My co-authors gave me permission to share this example. So you can see from the title, our review is examining the effect or association between pharmaceutical industry marketing and prescribing outcomes. You may realize that this will probably be a review that gets some media attention or some political attention, certainly some industry attention. It may or may not be controversial. During the protocol review process, editors raised concerns about intellectual conflict of interest. So several of the authors, myself included, have conducted extensive research on marketing activities of pharma. On the basis of this evidence and in our knowledge translation work, several of us have published or publicly expressed opinions on the topic. Many of us contribute to policy development, like Cochrane's, for example. So disclosing this, I think, is of limited value. It certainly would bring some transparency, but doesn't get to the heart of what people are really worried about, is that we are critical of the pharmaceutical industry, have suggested that clinicians be independent from industry, and that we would use this review to criticize industry regardless of what the data suggests. And so I think what we need to think about is whether disclosure actually deals with that problem. In reviewing the Cochrane policy principles, there isn't really a risk of interference because there's not a third-party interest. For independence, we certainly can't extract the data or conduct risk of bias on our articles we've authored. We've engaged a statistician who has no background in this content area as a means to try and increase the independence of the analysis. I think, though, for transparency and assurance, more work could be done. And currently, there's not really space in the disclosure statement to explain exactly where this team is coming from or what we do in terms of this work and where the review fits into that. And I think that would be an interesting methodological development for Cochrane to pursue. So I'm going to just wrap up here so we have lots of time to take these questions. But I just wanted to say that I'm currently recruiting implementers for an interview study, the next phase of this project in understanding non-financial interests. I want to really understand the perspective of policy implementers, so managing editors, guidelines, secretariat. I think not enough attention has been given empirically to this implementation phase and how we deal with these disclosures and all the sticky issues. And so if you have experiences with implementing conflict of interest policy, financial or non-financial, I would really be interested in hearing your experiences and would love to set up an interview. So please get in touch if that is of interest and feel free to share this invitation. So I just wanted to again thank Ruth for the invitation and the Cochrane Learning team for the technical assistance, and then recognize my co-investigators, so Lisa Barrow, Kelly Holloway, Brett Toombs, and Chris Mays. We've published a few pieces thus far on non-financial interests. I provide these here.